The number one structural difference between, I think, the way Turkish media is organized, this applies both to the audiovisual media, television especially, and to the newspaper branches in Turkey versus Europe, is the ownership question. As you probably know, most newspapers, most television channels in Turkey are owned by or are part of holdings that are active on many more issues in society, be it in the banking sector, the construction sector, or whatever. And for their owners, media or newspapers or television channel is only one of their commercial activities. This in Europe is totally different.
Birinci, yapısal farklılık Türkiye'deki ve Avrupa'daki gazeteleri ve televizyonu karşılaştırıyorum. Birinci yapısal farklılık medya patronları, yani medyadaki sahiplerden meydana geliyor. Türkiye'de medya, televizyon ve gazeteler için konuştuğumuzda özellikle medya bazı holdinglerin elinde. Bu holdingler açısından bakıldığında sahip oldukları televizyon ve gazete onların ticari aktivitelerinden sadece bir tanesi.
In most European countries, the media are part of sometimes very big, but media conglomerates. So newspapers, radio stations, television stations that are owned by someone who is a media boss, who has no interest at all in other parts of the economy. Why is this important? Because in many cases, both in the past and also in the present, media owners who also own a newspaper or a television channel use the media they have to please the government or not to offend the government, to get an offer or to get a job done in their other part of the holding, because they want to build a road or they want to have an airport construction to win the tender. And therefore media are instrumentalized by their owners for other commercial interests. This, to a large extent, determines how free media and how also free journalists can operate, because it's their owners who have totally different interests that are not linked to media, but are linked to the interest of the rest of the holding.
Make sure you're still talking about Turkey, right?
Yes.
Okay. Durum böyle olunca, piyasada birkaç medya patronu olunca, medya, özgür basından çok daha farklı amaçlar için kullanılabiliyor. Örneğin hükümeti memnun etmek, örneğin herhangi bir işinizi yaptırmak, örneğin herhangi bir havaalanının yapımına katkıda bulunmak ya da bir ihaleyi kazanmak ya da farklı bir ticari amaç için kullanılıyor medya.
I mean, I'm not going to go into all the individual or detailed examples, but for instance, NTV, part of Doğuş Holding, has changed its policy over the years. Sabah ATV, their media policy is influenced by the fact that they're part of a bigger holding that has commercial interests that go far beyond the newspapers and the television stations. To give you a very concrete example, I was talking to a minister recently in the present government, and he said the most difficult television station for us to tackle is Fox News, because they're very critical and they're only in media, so we can't influence their behavior by giving a prize or threatening their owners in another realm, because they're only media owners, they're only doing media. So that is an example of how things work in most of the European countries. You can criticize as a government a newspaper or a television channel, but how are you going to force the owners to change policy? There's nothing else to use against the owners. And so that's a big difference with Turkey.
Can you please explain your example again?
Fox News is part of a media conglomerate, an international media conglomerate. So Fox News is not in construction or in banking, so you can't influence or put pressure on Fox News by threatening to withhold a tender or...
Yeah, I get it.
And that's why Fox News is so difficult for this government to deal with, because it's very difficult to influence them or to put pressure on them.
Fox Haber örneğin, Fox Haber örneğini var. Fox Haber örneğin herhangi bir medya patronu tarafından yönetilmediği için hükümet tarafından bak sen böyle haber yapmazsan bu ihaleyi kazanamazsın diye tehdit edilemez diyor. Yani bu ihaleyi kaybetmekle tehdit edilemez. Özgür basın, özgür habercilik yapabilirler bu bağlamda diyor.
Okay, so it sounds maybe a technical thing who owns the media, but it's very important in the general policy of many newspapers and television channels that there is pressure not from the chief editor maybe, but from the owner to change policy or to write about certain things and not to write about other things. So that's the ownership of the media, which again is different in most other European countries. Second important difference is the general political and legal climate in which media operate. To put it very bluntly, in Turkey there are still tens of articles in the penal code that could be used, to put it strongly, that are being used by a totally politicized judiciary to make life difficult on journalists. These articles either don't exist in such high numbers in other European countries, or they sometimes exist but they are never used by a prosecutor because it's an old article that you will never use against a journalist. In Turkey it is possible, because of the present situation of the penal code, to put a lot of pressure on journalists, to make life difficult on journalists, because any prosecutor who doesn't like a particular newspaper or television channel always can find an article that he can use to start a court case.
In Turkey?
In Turkey.
Yeah. Okay. Diğer bir farklılık da politik ve hukuki ortamdan kaynaklanıyor. Türkiye'de eğer bir gazetecinin yaptığı haberi beğenmezse, bir otorite sahibi beğenmezse, dava açmak için herhangi bir kanun maddesi bulup gazetecinin üzerinde baskı oluşturabiliyor. Türkiye'de durum böyle ama Avrupa'da cezai kanun, cezai hukuk gazeteciler üzerinde bu şekilde işlemiyor.
So the list in Turkey of articles that can be used against journalists is much longer, and on top of that, they are being used much more actively by a politicized judiciary. To give you an example, in the Netherlands, for instance, there's an article in the law that forbids the insulting the Queen, or head of state. No, in the Netherlands. In England probably as well, but in the Netherlands, I'll give you the example from the Netherlands.
Okay.
So there's an article, a few articles, but one of them is it's forbidden to insult the Queen. This article, I think, has been used twice over the last 40 years, despite the fact that there have been many critical articles on the Queen or cartoons or whatever, but everybody thinks, this article is an old article, we're not going to remove it from the penal code, but we're not going to use it. In Turkey, every article is being actively used by a prosecutor. So that's a big difference in the legal climate, the legal background between Turkey and other countries.
Okay. Hollanda örneğini vardı. Örneğin Hollanda'da bir kanun var. Kraliçeye hakaret edemez hiç kimse, gazeteciler dahil. Ama bu kanun son 40 yıldır var. Herkes bu kanunun çok eski bir kanun olduğunu düşünüyor. Uygulanamayacağı konusunda tereddütler var. Ama Türkiye'de durum böyle değil. Her kanun gazeteci üzerinde uygulanabiliyor.
Third structural difference is that also in other countries there is sometimes enormous polarization between parts of the media. You have very populist, extreme right and more liberal, left-leaning newspapers. Still, the journalists working for either of the two newspapers would still show their solidarity when one of them or one of the others is in trouble. They are part of the same trade union for journalists. They speak to the government with one voice. So also the journalists from one newspaper will defend the rights of journalists that work in a totally different newspaper when they're under attack. In Turkey, the situation is so polarized, you know better than I do, that the journalists of one newspaper would never defend the rights of another newspaper because they're part of the other camp. If you were in A, you will never defend the interest of your colleagues in B. There's no union, there's no unified voice of journalists, which sometimes makes it very easy for the authorities to play one against the other. That's much more difficult in many European countries where journalists, despite their strong political differences among each other, still unite when they defend the rights of media or the rights of journalists.
Diğer bir yapısal farklılık da Türkiye'de gazeteciler arasında da, basın mensupları arasında da çok ciddi görüş ayrılıkları var. Polarizasyon, görüş ayrılıkları var. Sağ bakış ve sol bakış çok ayrı bakış açılarına sahip. Sağ ve solda basın mensupları. Örneğin sağ tarafta, sağ görüşü daha çok sağ tarafa yakın bir basın mensubuna karşı bir dava açıldığında farklı görüşlere sahip gazeteciler tarafından benimsenmiyor. Ama yurt dışında, Avrupa'da durum böyle değil. Bir birlik halinde tek vücut olarak hareket edebiliyorlar yurt dışında basın mensupları. Birine karşı dava açıldığında o gazeteciyle başka bir basın mensubunun görüşleri ayrı bile olsa onun yanında yer alabiliyor. Türkiye'de durum böyle değil. Bu da yetki sahiplerinin medya üzerinde çeşitli oyunlar oynamasına yol açabiliyor.